Now, you wrote this haunting account in which the life of a family and the life of a country of Syria become entangled and function as a whole. And it seems to me that at the core of your account lies the concept of property. There's ownership of one's life, of one's identity, of one's home, of one's ideas, thoughts, intimacy, and so on. What is it that you feel writing this book has helped you fully own?
Oh my God, that's a great question.
Thank you.
That is a really good question because, you know, I think to take it a little bit of a different way and then to come back around, one of the things that I've been thinking about so much, especially as I was working on, like, you know, people thinking about using the courts to find justice, is that so many Syrians sort of discount their need for individual justice, right? It's always about the collective, the collective, the collective. And I think that comes in huge part because the regime was all about destroying the sense of the individual. Like, especially when you are in Syrian prisons or bombarded by the Syrian regime or threatened by the Syrian regime or kept under, even before 2011, kept under that constant fear of like the mukhabarat, sort of like Stasi fear, like it erases your individuality. And it's funny, so I see it from I see that loss of individuality, both from the regime side and then also from Syrians themselves, and the constant recognition that, you know, the collective is so, you know, terribly cursed that that almost like an embarrassment to pursue your own justice or your own story. So I think the only thing that it has, writing this book has allowed me to fully own like my position in the Syrian thing, and nothing more, right? And also, yeah, it's allowed me to be fully comfortable with all the different positions I occupy in the Syrian story, some of which are more privileged than others. I mean, I have an American passport that is, and that in the end became sort of the most relevant thing about my destiny. And I hope what it means, because I work with other Syrians who think of doing their own memoirs or their own books. I encourage it so constantly, because I think that is in some ways the only thing we can own, our specificity. And going back to the trials, one of the things, because I was there the day of that big verdict, and I wanted to feel amazing things. I didn't feel amazing things, and then later in reflection, I thought, well, there is some justice. There's no justice for Syria at the capital J, but there is some justice for the narrative in those court cases, because the regime has been, part of its ability to continue to exist, or for the world to be paralyzed about what is truly happening in Syria, is that it says, well, everybody, these aren't individuals rising, individuals asking for freedom and dignity. This is the masses of terrorists, this, again, this like broad language of a way to discount who wrote, who was part of the Autoarea, the revolution, and part of these movements, and the people who came and testified in court at great risk by like lending the specificity of their biography, sort of chip away at that, right? It chips away at who the mass of Syrians are, and I think that's the same thing I did. I fully own my story in this book, and in the same way that I think other Syrians are starting to fully, like we have to be seen as individuals.
This is also a very, very wonderfully written book, because there is beauty in this tension between the story actually and history. And I felt like this very ambiguous space between social and political change and the way in which it affects multiple generations of a family is where you would actually like your readers to dwell. Now, whom did you actually write the book for?
I mean, you're supposed to like tell them, you're supposed to have an exact target audience. But I don't. My target is everyone. I don't see why. I mean, obviously, I'm thinking about like the group that I most want to not hate it are obviously other Syrians. And that's, so my breath is held more for like their reaction and their feedback. But I don't see why this book can't be read by anybody who I mean, everything about it is in many ways universal. Again, Syria has its specificity, the way it fell apart has its specificity. Romania has its specificity in its history, but, dictators, the fall of regimes, like and that fact that people have to live with the consequences of that's universal. So I would hope that anybody can come to the book. And yes, obviously it's not a manipulation, but there is something about narrative that allows us to enter into a story with our defenses a little bit down. And it's so funny, now that I teach journalism and I've looked into the idea of empathy, like there are actually there are studies, like neurologically, the brain responds differently in terms of an empathetic response when it's narrative, right? I mean, so history, academic writing is so crucial, so important, and I rely on it, I consume it, I read it. But there is something about a narrative, storytelling, that lets you to enter not just a story, but people's lives in a different way. So I would hope that anybody could come to it. And, it is a tricky balance, because I knew experts would read the book, experts on Syrian history, and then people who know nothing. And that is a balance. So I don't know, I hope it hit the balance. I know at the beginning it's very history heavy, but I'm one of these people that doesn't think you can just dive in. The story of what's happened in 2011 to today, it doesn't start in 2011. I think I even say that in the book. Like in the Middle East, a story about yesterday usually starts 100 years ago. So I didn't feel like I could step. I mean, other writers feel like I'm just going to put you in the story and you should be able to figure out who was good and bad. But yeah, I don't feel that way. But I felt like once the reader had a grounding, then I could take them forward. So when people can just make it through those first 2 chapters. So some people love the history buffs want to be all in that, but so
I'm not a history buff, but I love the history chapters. So yes. Yeah, so I think you really nailed it with this book. And while reading, I kept thinking that the tragedy of your grandmother trapped alive in a paralyzed body was a metonymy for the tragedy of Syria, which ultimately functioned as a prison for anyone who expressed different views from the regime, from the ruling regime. Now, yet your generation claims ownership of memory, of freedom, of a sense of a country. What is, to you, let's say, the most important thing that you've learned about her and about yourself while writing this memoir?
Wow, these are really good questions. About her, just that it was like in many ways an unactualized life. And I think the metaphor is just even more general. It's just one of stasis. Like I never felt like, it felt like the future had, felt like nothing moved in Syria. It was really that. And to me, as you know, in the book, like what happens to her happens when I'm 6 years old, and then like all of it sort of like Syria and her become intertwined in my mind, and it's an understanding of absolute stasis, like being alive in a dead body. And whether that's fair, I mean, that's obviously not fully fair. Of course, there's culture, things are happening in Syria, but from a diaspora perspective, I mean, yeah, all I can say is utterly painful what happened to her. And what I've learned about her is sort of what I've learned about the region is that we have been in constant tragedy and constant trauma, you know, and also as an American, you know, 9/11 happens and like the entire world has to go through our trauma with us. And we have today's Memorial Day. Like I was, you know, in the car, all the radio stations were like, and we honor those who gave their lives for our freedom. I mean, in Syria, like it's been perpetual tragedy, perpetual trauma, and there's no pausing, there's no acknowledgement of that, you know. So for her, it is, you know, I think she sees what life what she could, where she could, and had deep meaning and deep impact on the people around her. And I think that is kind of true of Syrians. But ultimately, you know, I think the life that she could have lived and the potential that she could have had was taken from her because of, and taken from everybody because of the kind of society that Syria ended up becoming. Not just because there's a repressive regime, but, you know, as you might know, like, I mean, a repressive regime, there's it's in the book, there's a quote from a South African poet that you are, of course, the victim of an authoritarian regime, but you're also its collaborator. I mean, you know, for a regime that's been around for 40 years now, 50 years, you know, when you become part of, it's an infection, right? And it infects the body. I mean, the metaphor works on so many levels. What did I learn about myself? Just that I'm somehow incredibly lucky, incredibly privileged. Syrians, you go outside of Syria and every Syrian's almost, it seems like every Syrian is successful. You know, other Syrians have become presidents of other countries. You know, the Pfizer BioNTech, they were a Turkish couple, but he's actually Syrian, and he's one of the Syrians displaced. So I mean, you know, just like Syrians anywhere can do great things, but in that society they cannot. Yeah, I don't know. Also, not a great answer. You're asking really deep questions.
We have a similar saying in Romania, and you cannot be a prophet in your own country. So you know, there's very valuable research in your book, and research that brings to life narratives circulating inside Syria and outside Syria. Now there's the types of political, of ethnic, of religious, of, as you said, totalitarian discourse, and you examine all of them carefully, and you're still in awe at how things actually progressed from the so-called Arab Spring to the Syrian tragedy and to this massive refugee crisis we have all been witnessing. What do you feel to have been the main ingredients, let's say, to such a complex and such a long-term conflict? Because you've examined such a wide portion of time, and yet there comes this point when it becomes difficult to grasp with one's mind the complexity of everything going on there.
Main ingredients, I think. Okay, I mean, something I've thought about a lot. I think that in Syria, and this leads to the sectarianism and leads to the looking of an external sort of patron, whether it's Saudi Arabia or Iran, right? It's this, the idea, again, it's the idea of the individual already discounted. Also the idea of the citizen, right? There is no, you are not a citizen of Syria. You know, you are just a pawn in, you know, the Syria belongs to them. Right, whereas like I think in America, for example, or so-called democracies, there's this idea that the country belongs to the people, and that is definitely not the conceptualization of that relationship in Syria. And so that's really like the meaning of to be a citizen of a place is meaningless. So I don't think we are inherently sectarian, not at all. But like identity politics. That's how it works, right? It sort of makes you believe that you need to look to this. I mean, one of the results of identity politics is the looking for like an external patron. So this idea that only Iran can protect, you know, the Shia, or only the Saudis, the Sunnis. So like it allows that lack of the meaning of citizenship having any true meaning in Syria leads to a place where, yes, people are going to look to external patrons, and external patrons played nothing but a bad faith role. I mean, there wasn't a single external, whether it's Russia or Iran or the Saudis and the Americans on the other side, or the French or the Turks, like there's not a single good faith player in that. And so like, so if I look at the problems of Syria, it's like the idea that the societal fabric came apart, the external meddling, you know, the dirty regime, and that sort of all comes from an idea of the lack of an idea of citizenship, or that the country belongs to you, right? So that also helps with all the corruption and the cronyism. You know, so it's, you know, it's a really hard question, but also the French played such a dirty role in the Mandate years. And I think, you know, the setting up of you know, the Syrian army to really be more not an agent, not something to protect Syria from external threats, but from internal. You know, the idea that, you know, this idea that like the threats come from the inside more from the outside. But yeah, it's in, you know, those are some of the main. Those would be the main ingredients. Like I'm trying to like really distill it to like if you could start with just one. And, you know, unfortunately, we live during a Cold War. We live in a post-Cold War, still like geopolitical, like struggle. We live in regional, like struggles for hegemony between Iran and Iraq. And Iran and Saudi Arabia. And we also live in a world where like, and the other main ingredient I should say is that, you know, 30 years of the war on terror discourse, or 20 years, right? It's been 20 years since 9/11. And that discourse that really demonizes Muslims and Arabs builds on a much earlier, but it's like, it's a continuation, but like it goes crazy after 9/11, that I just think the world stopped seeing Arabs and Muslims as human beings. And, you know, this idea that the violence committed by Muslims and Arabs is the uber violence, like greater, I mean, like man is violent. I don't know really how you quantify and compare, right, the violence, like a murder is a murder, like, you know, and I think that discourse really made it possible to look away from what was happening and to see Syrians, and like the regime knew how to weaponize that discourse.
Because as a journalist and as a foreigner, in the end you risked a lot. What kept you going?
I mean, Syrians there were also risking a lot more. But yeah, the narrative, like, I mean, you know, it comes back to the narrative. And I think that is a big reason that Syria, we see this Syria paralysis, like just total loss of clarity as to what is going on. And I remember when I was inside, you know, for the people who are trying to cover Syria from the outside, it was of course always a focus on those actions that are militaristic. But I just don't think that is where, you know, that is not where the story was. It's not the only place where the story was happening. I grew up as an Arab in the United States, so I understand the importance of narratives. I understand, you know, who's suffering, whose lives, whose cultural production are valued or not valued. And that is because of the narratives that we know about these other people. And so, yeah, I was really just determined that the narrative wouldn't be fully out of my control, or fully out of Syrian control. I mean, as much as possible, you know, and ultimately, yes, I wrote the book, but it's not about me 100%. And yeah, you have to trust me. You have to trust me that I can maybe, you know, and you don't have to. I'm saying one would have to trust me to trust the version of the narrative that I give. And I try to earn that trust by being completely transparent in the book as to what I know and what I cannot know, because of places I can and cannot go. Never felt really accurate. It never felt really complete or full. And I had access, and so I was going to use that access while I had it.